Good morning. Okay, you can speak. Sorry, I know you got a mask on, but you can speak. This is what you all look like. Someone, a good friend of mine, good preaching friend of mine. Yes, I'm preacher. Thank you, Adam. Adam and I have met real well. I was talking to a good preacher friend of mine this week, and he said, when are y'all opening back up? I said, Sunday. He said, 12 weeks, they haven't seen you. They've been blessed. And I said, I have the face that's made for radio. And we've been able to practice that somewhat. Several have asked me, how did you like that? Well, you know, there's several things in the preacher's realm that we've talked about, us preachers kind of, in chats and different things and telephone conversations. One is, you've preached like you've never preached before. What are some things you're doing in your preaching that you've never done? And some preacher said, I never thought I would preach in my pajamas. I have dressed for you every Sunday, I assure you, to beautify the service. But we are glad that you're here. I am glad to be here. Suzanne is glad to be here. We are delighted to be a part of the River Road congregation. We're delighted that we have been extended this invitation. And let me tell you how much we love the elders. Anybody that extends an invitation to me to speak, we love them. We appreciate George, appreciate Jay, appreciate the selection committee, the hard work that they did. We obviously think they made an excellent choice, but we think that they did a tremendous job, and we appreciate them. Appreciate Jerry and the work that he did as the interim. By the way, had lunch Thursday with Josh, so know Josh well or better now, and so we're thankful for all the things that have been done leading us up to this point. A couple of you have asked. We are moving this coming Friday. Movers are coming Friday morning to our house in Dixon, getting our stuff and moving it. We are moving in this coming Friday. Some things will still need to be done, but that's all right. We need to move, and we need to get our house on the market and get to moving, and life needs to get to as normal as possible. And I realize this is not normal. I feel like I am back in the day when I was, as kids, we played cowboys and Indians, and we played cops and robbers, and half of us wore masks and the others didn't. But it is a different time in our society in which we live, and I appreciate that, and I hope you appreciate that as well. But we're here this morning to worship God, and grateful for that opportunity to see you, and I know that you are glad that you're getting to see folks you haven't seen in quite a while. And so that's always a great blessing. Story is told of a man that owned a business. He was the president. Vice president of the company had just grown tired of the way things were going. Didn't like the way things were going, and had just made himself a tremendous nuisance around the office, around the company, till finally one day he walked out. When he walked out, he burned all of his bridges behind him. He told everybody what he thought. He told everybody what he felt. A few days later, the president of the company got a phone call from another company. And as they were talking to him about this particular vice president that had quit and had acted so ugly on his way out. This president couldn't say enough nice things about the man. And some overheard him and knew the conversation and what was going on. And they finally said, what in the world are you doing? Why are you so nice? Why are you talking so nice about him after all the bad things he said about you and about this company? And simply put, the man said, when they called me, they asked me about my opinion of him, not his opinion of me or of this place of work. You know, we're living in a time in which, admittedly, we wonder if everything is as it should be. There we go. No. One more time? Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I had it right. There we go. We're sitting down and we're talking. Thank you, Jay. We're talking about race in our day and age. And I wonder how many of us not so much are having difficulty sitting down and talking about it and understanding what has happened through the years. But I wonder how many of us have remembered and should have remembered, and I think we have remembered, just some Christian principles that go along with talking to everyone, no matter where we're from, no matter the color of our skin, no matter the preference that we have politically, the preference we have spiritually, just common niceties. After all, sin may be defined as that which contradicts sonship with God and brotherhood with mankind. In other words, if you really think about that definition of sin, and that's my favorite definition of sin, sin is anything that violates our relationship with God. If you will, what some folks call the vertical relationship. But sin is not only a violation of that vertical relationship, but God addresses how we deal with man and deals with each other individually. And so there is that horizontal relationship that we have that we must maintain as well. Paul wrote to a young preacher by the name of Titus. And the book of Titus is an interesting book because basically Paul tells Titus, I want you to practice, or I want you to put into practice the Word of God. I want you to do what God has told you to do. And so he says to put them in mind, verse 1, to obey of chapter 3, to obey rulers and those that are in authority. Be peaceable, gentle. Then he says in verse 2, to speak evil of no man. And there's the key for us this morning. We do not need to speak evil of anyone. And notice that's the encompassing thought that Paul had to Titus. It was, don't speak evil to anyone. You may not agree with folks that you work with or your next door neighbor religiously. You may not agree with them politically. You may not see eye to eye with them. But how are you to deal with them? How are you to treat them? How are you to talk to them? Well, that's our lesson this morning. The first thing I want us to understand is that we always need to work on ways in which we think about others. Attitude is what causes us to act the way we act. We act the way we act because of the attitude that we have. And the attitude that we have is that which we think about others. You see, attitude, by definition of Webster, is a state of mind or a disposition towards someone or something. It's the way you feel about people. It's the way you feel about events. You feel strongly, so you'll take a stronger stand. If you don't feel strong about something, you might take a little bit of a back step, because that's your attitude in those areas. Solomon addressed this idea, didn't he? As a man thinks in his heart, do you remember the rest of the verse? So is he. Proverbs chapter 4. And so he says in chapter 23, verse 11, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Watch your heart. Watch what you think about. That's why Paul talked about in Philippians chapter 4, here's the things I want you to think about: the true, the noble, the honest, the just, the pure, the lovely, and the good report. Paul says, these are the things I want you to think about. These are the things I want you to dwell on. True love, as Paul defined it in 1 Corinthians 13. True love thinks no evil. Verse 7. Now when you get through all those characteristics, and you think about thinks no evil, he doesn't think about what is bad, what is corrupt. So oftentimes we do, right? You ever driven down the road, and of course it's been my daily trip from at least Monday through Thursday to come down the interstate. And as you do, maybe one day you say, okay, there's a dead whatever in the middle of the road or off to the side of the road. Hasn't been there before. 2 or 3 days later, what do you see? The buzzards circling or the buzzards eating. They're eating that rotting carcass. Well, why? Well, that's their food source. That's exactly right. That's the way God made them. Absolutely. But you see, they've been flying around all this time looking for what? The dead, the rotten. We can find the rotten in everything. We can find the rotten in all kinds of people. We can find the rotten in the world and in society. But we need to stop and remember that while we keep our heart, we understand that it is out of the abundance of the heart. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus says that the mouth speaks. It's out of the abundance of the heart. It's out of the heart. Out of the evil heart proceeds evil things. Out of the good heart proceeds what? Good things. And so the wise man does what? Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 27. He seeks good. He finds value in it. The story is told of a young man that came up to the elders and he said, I'm leaving this congregation. I'm not coming back. And so the elders said, okay, but tell us why. And the young man said, well, it's simply this. He says, I have heard a lot of folks talking about one another. And I've heard a lot of folks that they're criticizing this, that, and the other. And I just don't want that anymore. And so the elder said, we understand. But we would like to ask something of you. And the young man said, fine, what is it? They said, we want you to come back one more time. Come back next Sunday, if you will. And when you come, at the end of service, we want you to take a full glass of water and we want you to walk around the auditorium 3 times. Once you've walked around it 3 times, holding that full glass of water, I said, if you want to leave or if you don't want to come back, we completely understand. And we have no problem with you leaving. All will be fine. The young man agreed. The next Sunday he was there. The final amen was said. He took his glass full of water. He walked around the auditorium 3 times. As he walked out, he told the elders, I'll be back next week. Fine. What changed? He said, well, as I was walking around the auditorium, I was so concentrating upon the glass of water. I didn't hear all of the criticism. I didn't hear all of the backbiting. I didn't hear all of the things that were said. And the elders made the point. It's what you concentrate on. It's what you dwell on. It's what you think on that ultimately becomes the rhythm part of your life. So let's be sure, if we're not going to speak evil of others, that we need to work on the way we think about others. Think about them with love and kindness. Think about them as good folks intending well. But then secondly, we need to be encouraging. Encouragement is sort of the grease that keeps the wheels of life moving, aren't they? We all need encouragement. We all like encouragement. We all enjoy encouragement. Encouragement that comes from the heart really lifts up the heart. The word encourage, if you go back to the old Latin, is the idea of the heart. It's the idea of giving heart to. That's what encouragement is. It's giving heart to another person. It's lifting the souls of the spirits of individuals that, for whatever reason, have felt defeated. It's reassuring the confidence of one whose confidence, once again, is shaken for whatever has gone on in their life. It's the idea of putting a rose in a vase that's empty, a smile on a heart that's aching. It's the idea of lifting someone up so as to make them feel more confident, to give them the assurance to keep on, to give them the assurance to do in life what they need to do. Encouragement's important. You see, we can encourage people and we can discourage people, can't we? It was the Depression. Nobody was selling anything at that point in time. But there was a man that started a business at the beginning of the Depression era. And as he was he sold many hot dogs. Matter of fact, he'd become, in the Depression era, he had become a millionaire selling hot dogs. People couldn't believe it. Somebody finally said, you do understand that there's a depression going on. And they sat and talked with the man for a long length of time. And he said, what do you mean? He said, well, nobody has any money. Nobody's buying anything. He says, man, they're buying my hot dogs like crazy. He said, and this guy said, nobody's buying anything. Nobody's placing any orders. And so the man began to cut his hot dog orders. Not because his business was failing, but because he'd been convinced that people had no money and didn't want to buy hot dogs. And he kept cutting his orders till finally, guess what? He had to go out of business. All because someone discouraged him instead of encouraging him. The work of encouragement is the work of every child of God that wants to practice what God has said do. Exhort one another daily, the Hebrew writer wrote in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 13. In Hebrews chapter 10, where we talk about not forsaking the assembly, and our good brethren that are listening to us, we do not count as forsaking the assembly. We understand that there comes a time sometimes when we can't all meet in one building. But yet at the same time, have you looked at the context of Hebrews 10:25? Have you understood that why the Hebrew writer told them to go to church? It was so that they would provoke one another. Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another. So much the more as you see the day approaching. What's the day? The day of judgment. In other words, the assembling was a time of encouragement. Now, the last 12 weeks, have we had to listen to one another through the telephone? Yes. Are we going to have to do it on Sunday night and Wednesday night? Yes. May there come a time in which we have to go back to that for every service? Yes. That's all right. We were still assembling as the church. And while we could see each other face to face and we could talk to one another, that's the encouraging part of getting together. But that's the responsibility of every child of God, to find it in the Word of God, and to find times in which we speak. Why? We speak encouraging words. Why? Because Paul reminded the church at Rome. In Romans chapter 12, he says, having therefore these gifts, minister. Every one of us is a minister. And he says, you having your gifts, minister. In other words, you having these gifts, use them. And then you jump down to verse 8. Do you remember what verse 8 says? He that encourages, let him encourage. Let's lift up one another. Let's provoke one another to love and to good works. Let's encourage folks. Well, how do we go about encouraging folks? Think highly of them, as we talked about in the first point. Look at them with a loving mindset. Looking for what is good, not what is bad. Finding something in their life, something that's going on with them, wherein you can provoke confidence and reassurance in them. A simple pat on the back means a lot. You ever watch people? You ever watch people go through life and you pat them on the back, all of a sudden they walk a little straighter, the smile's a little brighter, their eyes are a little happier? We need to learn to encourage one another. Not to be discouragers of folks. Let no bitterness proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good for the use of edifying. That's what Paul reminds us in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29. For a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and pictures of silver. It's a beautiful thing, Solomon said in Proverbs 25, verse 11. And so if we want to have that good, kind conversation, we not only think about folks good, but we also, when we're with them and when we talk to them, we encourage them. But then thirdly, we be gracious in the way that we respond to them. That's not always easy. Because while encouragement becomes the grease of the soul, also that same mouth can be used to bite others, can't it? And hurt. And sometimes, as we respond, we're not gracious in our response. Sometimes we have to learn to be the bigger man and just take the fall as it goes. I remember years ago, Suzanne and I, we have, if you've forgotten, we have one son. Ethan is, well, let's see, born in 1990, so he's 29, he'll be 30 in October. Is that right, Shake? Thank you. I get lost. Ethan will be 30 in October. We hope in 2 or 3 weeks, maybe they'll get up this way, and you'll get to meet them. Ethan was one of these that played all kinds of sports. And I remember about the 3rd year he was playing little baseball. He enjoyed baseball greatly. I was helping coach. I was the guy that was willing to, we need folks to help coach. I'll help. And I helped. And the head coach, I was the assistant coach of the team, or I was the co-head coach of that team actually, went up to a guy and said, man, that player on your team, he's a really good player. And the guy said, yeah, we know it. Well, I know that coach and become friends with that coach since then. He's a good guy. But his arrogance and his ego at that point in time was not something that really matched up the way any individual should act. As I coached Ethan's soccer teams, as I coached Ethan's soccer teams, we particularly had one young boy that when he scored a goal, and soccer is a tremendous sport, and it's hard to score a goal, but every time he'd score a goal, it was like he had conquered the world. And every time, I would try to say, remember the other guy. Remember you haven't done this before, or you've done this before. Remember. Celebrate. But keep it to a minimum. You've been here before. And act like it. I tried to tell Ethan that, but especially the other little boy. Ethan was one. He was very mellow. He just scored a goal. He'd walk to the other end. He's much like his mama. Because I'd have been running around the field too. I'd been like that other kid. Running around the field. You need to learn to be gracious. That's really hard to do. And yet, when you look at the Bible, isn't our speech to be gracious? That's what Paul said in Colossians chapter 4, verse 6. Paul says, let your speech be gracious, seasoned with salt. Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 10 that the speech of the wise man, verse 12, is gracious. Learning to act like you've been there. And not only act like you've been there, but willing then to even suffer a little bit at the hands of others because you need to be the bigger man. One of the most difficult things is to be the bigger man. Why? Because we want to let them go, and we want to tell them, and we want to tell them off, and we want to show them, and we want to know that they didn't get one over on us. Is that what this Bible says? Doesn't this Bible say to be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake has forgiven you? Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32. Sure. This Bible teaches us that we need to be gracious in our answers and gracious in our response to people. Charity, love, suffers long, and is kind. Verse 5 of 1 Corinthians 13. We need to work on ourselves. I wonder, don't you, how Diotrephes acted? Remember 3 John? Do you remember what John said there? That when he came, that he was going to take care of Diotrephes. He was one that loved to have the preeminence. He loved to have his way. We don't have the conversation between John and Diotrephes. I don't know that I would necessarily want to see it. But I'm sure that he put Diotrephes in his place. But yet, if he would abide by what God would say, he would do it graciously. He would do it with love. He would do it with compassion. He would do it with all the care that he had. Sometimes our answers aren't gracious. And we need to be careful that if we're going to have kind conversation, that we respond to people as graciously as we can. But then, we also need to treat each other. And we need to treat each other fairly. True Christianity is second mile Christianity, isn't it? Whoever compels you to go with him a mile, go with him too. Isn't that what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verse 41? Those folks understood what Jesus was saying. And we do too. But let's put that text within its historical context. In biblical times, a Roman soldier might come and tell a citizen, here, take this, and take maybe his shield or part of his armor. And the individual was compelled by law to take that 1 mile. And then at the end of the mile, he could stop. And most of them, that's what they did because they were compelled to do it. They were under Roman authority. They didn't like it. And here they were having to carry somebody's burden, if you will, that wasn't theirs. And they didn't want to carry it. And so they were carrying it. And they'd carry a mile and they'd get that mile and they'd throw it down and they'd walk back. They wanted nothing to do with that. But Jesus said, my way's a little different. My way, don't just carry it the 1 mile. Carry it 2 miles. Carry it the 2nd mile. Go a little bit further. Let the kindness, let the love that you're supposed to have, let it show. Jesus said it this way, whatever you would that men should do to you, you do even so to them. And upon that very thought, we call it the golden rule, was to hang all the law and the prophets. Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. In other words, this is something that's not new. This is something that's been around for a long time. What is it? What's been around for a long time? The idea of treat each other as fairly as possible. Now, you might catch that I talk a lot about my son. Why? Because he's the only one guy. And as Suzanne said one time when the lady said, you know, talking about me, and this was before Ethan was born, she said, your husband sure talks a lot about you from the pulpit. She said he has to talk about what he knows, and he knows about so little. But he does know about me that it's all right. And I talk about Ethan now because he's not here. But when Ethan was young, he had a tremendous sense of fairness. And oftentimes, he'd come home, and he still has this, by the way. His mom had a conversation with him not long ago that I thought, yeah, I remember this as a kid. That he would come home. Well, Miss So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so, they weren't fair. They didn't do this or they didn't do that at school. They weren't fair. And while sometimes it was a battle to help him understand, well, they were fair, you're just not seeing the other side. But I've often thought about, are we treating folks fairly? Do we go the 2nd mile? Now, sometimes, and I know this and you know this as well too, you give them that 2nd mile and they think, well, they want a 3rd or 4th mile, right? And there's just a limit as far as where you can go, and that's understandable. I think even by the Lord. But if you get back to the point before this, if you act graciously towards them, then you say, look, I do have boundaries. And I've reached my boundary. But when we deal with folks and we're having this kind conversation with them, we need to learn to treat them fairly. Treat them equally. Treat them as individuals that are just that, individuals. Treat them with love, with respect. Treat them with kindness. Treat them graciously. Kind conversation. I think conversation needs to be had by us all the time, in the church, in the world, in society. But I think it needs to be done kindly. Frederick the Great was leader of Prussia, which is, I know it's not exactly, but it's Germany. He was in the 1700s, 1740 to 1783, I believe, the years that he ruled in Prussia. One day, a lady came to him and said, "My husband is treating me terribly. My husband is treating me unfairly. My husband is terrible to me. He says terrible things about me." To which Frederick the Great said, "Ma'am, that's something I don't need to know about." And so when she couldn't get a rise out of Frederick the Great, she said, "Well, he talks about you bad also." And Frederick the Great looked at her and said, "Ma'am, that is none of your concern." You see, I think we kind of hit the nail on the head. Sometimes things are not our concern, and we need to stay out of them. Sometimes they are. And when we get involved, think nice things, encourage, be gracious, and be fair. The Lord set up for us His will, His way for our life. What a great blessing it is to know that we are His children, taught not only how to deal with Him, worship, honor, and respect, but also how we're to deal with one another. And in our time and in our society and at the point in which we are, may we never, ever take God's Word out of how we deal with others. May we always have it as the foundation for our life. This morning, we've not talked about the plan of salvation, but we have talked about something that is very important to God. That's how to deal with others. If you're not a New Testament child of God, if you need to confess that you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and you need to be baptized for the remission of your sins, our prayer is that you'll do that today. Or if you're an individual that is needing the prayers of the church, prayers of forgiveness as you acknowledge things in your life that are not right, or maybe you just need prayers, our prayer is that you'll come. All together we stand and sing.